Hi everyone, thank you for joining today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Nancy Amar. I'm an occupational therapist. I've been working with children for the past 13 years and I focus on children with autism. My goal for the live streams that I do is really to help parents and caretakers and therapists really understand children with autism a little bit more and really create strategies to assist them, right? Not really fix them at all, but rather understand them and from that place help them be. So today we're going to talk about creating sensory diets, what they are, how we create it, how we implement it, how we can make one for your kids. That's the goal. So before we start, we need a little bit of background information. A lot of people think when I say let's create a sensory diet, they think that it has something to do with eating, right? Which it doesn't at all. Eating is a separate thing that we need to talk about in terms of autism. However, a sensory diet, this was a term that was coined by Patricia Wilbarger, who is an OT and clinical psychologist, and her expertise was to work with sensory defensiveness. So the term sensory diet is really something that we do regularly. That's what we mean by the diet. And just like a child all of us, we need to eat every day. So too, there's some children that need the sensory input, throughout their day in order to self-regulate in the environment. So first thing we want to do is look at the different ranges of arousal that we have. Because ideally, what is a sensory diet? A sensory diet are the sensory activities that we organize and input in a child's schedule so that they can maintain that optimal level of arousal during the day. We want them at that alert level where they're optimally able to learn, able to interact with their environment. That's really the goal, right? And so for these children that have a hard time with their sensory environment, we want to give them that input. So there's 3 levels of arousal that we look at and that fluctuate throughout the day. None of them are negative. It's really just the way that human beings are. So we have under arousal, we have optimal arousal, and then we have over arousal, right? So depending on what's going on during the day, there could be a fluctuation. And it's not to look at under arousal or over arousal as something negative. If we were at a roller coaster ride, you want to have that, over arousal happen. It's a normal part of the experience that we have, but it's how to get back to that baseline, right? So when we look at a child that's under aroused, then we see a child that's really sluggish, that's slow. And what's interesting is that the behavior that we could be seeing is actually a child that's fidgeting, right? Because they're trying to keep themselves alert, right? So the system is sluggish, the system is slow, but then you see this child starting to fidget or move around in the classroom, right? Because they need to get their arousal level up so that they can stay alert to be able to learn. So again, for a child that has this under arousal, we want to create activities that will increase that alertness. Then we have what we call the optimal arousal level, right? This is the just right that we're looking for. We're looking for the child to be alert, to be focused, to be organized, right? Optimally, this is where we want to be at. And then we have the over arousal, which is a child that's very anxious, that's very disorganized, that can't focus, right? Really feels very hyper. The behavior is very erratic sometimes. And for a child like that, what we need to look at is, again, the calming strategies, right? So now the goal is, again, to bring a child to this optimal arousal level. That's what we want, ideally. And the way that we achieve it is through creating all these sensory activities throughout the day. And one of them being that we could create it through a sensory diet, right? As therapists, as occupational therapists, we get asked a lot to implement these sensory diets. I personally love to see children just interact with the environment and be outdoors and play outdoors instead of implementing a sensory diet the way that we're implementing it right now. But I know that, reality check, there's also the way that schools are structured, homes are structured, parents don't have time for, to be outdoors all the time, just the way that society is created. It's not like when we were younger, I think we were able to play outside on our own a lot, or minimal supervision. parents would check us out from inside the house. They would just peek on us. But nowadays things have changed a lot, so children don't have that experience as much. They don't have the experience of being outdoors as much. So again, we create these sensory diets to be able to supplement that, right? So now if you look at it from a physiological point of view in terms of why we create a sensory diet, is because these types of sensory activities will help strengthen the dopamine and serotonin, right? And those are neurotransmitters that allow more calming and organizing in the brain, right? So that's the idea behind these sensory diets. So now if we want to create a sensory diet that creates that optimal level of arousal, we want to look at specific sensory strategies, what time of the day that we're going to be doing it, and the duration of the sensory diet. So the first thing we look at is the sensory activities. You want to start with what your child has as preferences. What do they like best? That's going to give you an indication of probably what are the things that calm them the most, the things that arouse them the most, and also the things that they completely avoid, right? So start creating a little list for yourself of what you see your child likes most. What is calming them the most? What do they gravitate towards, right? That'll be a really good starting point. Then what we look at is, it's not blood, it's nail polish. Then we look at the three different types of inputs that we can have when we implement a sensory diet, all right? So, and you want to do them in that kind of sequential order. We look at vestibular input. That's the first thing we look at. And vestibular input is the part of us that processes movement, okay? In general, vestibular input is alerting. That's the effect that it has on the central nervous system. It's an alerting type of sensation, okay? And usually when you want to do some kind of vestibular input, you want to know that about 15 minutes of vestibular input will give you an effect for about 8 hours. So it's one of the really, really powerful types of sensory inputs that you can give a child to help them self-regulate. And by vestibular input, I will go into a little more detail a little bit later, but these are anything that create movement, right? So we want to do things like jumping and running and somersaults, anything that moves. Swinging is definitely the best and most powerful of the vestibular inputs that you can provide a child, but there are other ways to do it. Then after you give a child this vestibular input, so that's where it creates alertness, then we go to proprioceptive input. Now proprioceptive input is how the body processes where the body is in space, right? And that's done through the joints and the muscles, whereas vestibular input is the inner ear. So when you look at the proprioceptive input, it's almost like if I ask you to close your eyes and stand tall and ask you where your knees are, you can touch them without opening your eyes, or where you're standing specifically in a room. You can do that. You have that sense of proprioception, that sense of where your body is in space. That's proprioceptive input. And a lot of children with autism have a lot of difficulties with that sense. And we see that a lot in the lack of body awareness. So proprioceptive input, you want to, again, at this point what we're processing is where the body is in space. And when we give proprioceptive input, what it does to the central nervous system is actually it organizes the central nervous system. And if you give about 20 minutes of proprioceptive input, it has an effect for about 2 hours. So again, we start with vestibular, we move on to proprioceptive, and afterwards you want to end with something that's deep pressure tactile input, right? So the deep pressure tactile input, what it has as an effect to the central nervous system is that it's very calming, right? It's very soothing, it's very calming, it's very organizing. We have to be careful with tactile input. Some people don't realize that when you gently touch someone's skin, that has an alerting effect, actually, right? So it's almost a fight or flight that gets kicked in for children that are very sensitive or very defensive to touch. But when you squeeze, you can try it yourself. Give yourself a squeeze versus just gently put your fingers on your arm. When you give a squeeze, that's different. That gives them that calming, soothing effect that we're looking for. Okay, so again, when you're creating your sensory diet, you want to have these steps involved. You want to start with vestibular, which makes them alert. You then want to move on to proprioceptive. That's going to organize the system. And then you move to deep pressure, where we're talking about calming the system. So some vestibular activities that you can do, again, vestibular system is in the inner ear. So any movement of the head will cause that fluid in the ear that we want to move. And that's what gives the input to the central nervous system. So anything that involves movement, definitely, like I said before, swinging is by far the fastest and most efficient way to get to the vestibular system. But there are other ways. You can just running, jumping, trampolines, somersaults. Let me see what else I wrote here. Gymnastics, hanging upside down, any of these types of movement, playing tag, playing chase, all this that involves movement will touch upon the vestibular system. Then when we move on to proprioceptive movement, again, I said before, that's the information for proprioceptive input is in the joints and in the muscles. So we want to get more of the deep pressure to go into the joints and in the muscles so that information can be sent to the central nervous system. So the way that we do that is actually through heavy work, right? If a person can feel that heaviness, we're going towards, we attain the proprioceptive system. So you want to do heavy resistive work. So weighted items or books, carrying heavy books, carrying, pushing, pulling, doing wall push-ups, doing sit-ups also, chewing gum. Those gives a lot of input from the mouth. Suction, like sucking through a straw, or even vibration. We have toys that have vibration, do it over the muscle belly. Bear hugs, climbing, weighted vest, joint compressions. Joint compressions, this is something that I teach parents how to do. But again, it's pretty simple and gives inputs exactly to the joint to send information to the central nervous system to help organize the system. And afterwards, like I said, we finish off, if we have time, ideally, again, these are ideals. If we have time, we finish off with deep pressure, right? So that would be something like a massage, something with lotion, squeezing, hugs, right? Taking pillows and squeezing a pillow itself or a teddy bear, right? All that kind of deep pressure is also extremely calming. If you're in doubt of what to do in terms of sensory input, you don't know if your child needs alertness or they need calming, or you don't know if you should go for vestibular or proprioceptive, and that feels confusing to you, err on the side of doing proprioceptive input, right? All the heavy type of work, heavy pushing and pulling, okay? I love doing things just on the floor, right? I feel like the ground is grounding. Just have them lay on the floor or even crawl on the floor, commando crawling, doing something through a tunnel. So if you're going to do any type of vestibular activity, if you're going to implement a sensory diet and then you are doing vestibular, always make sure that after vestibular you take the time to do something proprioceptive, because you don't want to just leave them at that alertness level. You want to alert them, organize them, and then you move on, right? You don't want to just do the vestibular. You want to do vestibular, get that alertness level up, and then organize them with something that's proprioceptive. So again, now we'll recap, just putting it all together. When you want to create a sensory diet, you want to start with knowing what your child's preferences are. That's going to be a starting point for you to see what they gravitate towards. Then you want to create a schedule where you look at their schedule throughout the day, and you want to implement strategically where you're going to be able to implement these different types of sensory inputs for them. Sometimes you will have the time to do a full sensory diet like we discussed, where you're doing vestibular, probe, deep pressure. Sometimes you might not. So you have to start thinking about, oh, maybe I can implement here. We'll stop off at the playground before going home to do homework, or implement in their routine something that gives them the input, for example, swimming classes or gymnastics, something like that, right? So we have to be a little bit strategic about what we implement so that they're getting their fix that they do need. They get that sensory input, but it doesn't have to be through implementing so many times a day the sensory diet as we discussed before. So start over there, and then again, like I said, when you're in doubt of what kind of input to implement, proprioceptive is the way you want to go. And then always monitor the child. Monitor how your child is reacting to the sensory diet, to the different types of input, right? You want to make sure that they're not overly aroused, and you also want to look at the complete opposite of that spectrum where you find them become more lethargic, right? So you want to monitor that. Again, this is something that you can discuss with your occupational therapist. What I love to do is really start off. I don't give a sensory diet that comes from a list, you know. I really love to start it off with the child. I see what their preferences are. I work with the parent to see, you know, they start seeing at home what the child likes more. I get to know the child and know what I feel works best. And then we make choices together. And for the children that could make choices, I give them choices, right? And then I have done in the past also creating like little sensory boxes that a child brings to school so they can implement the sensory diet at school. And again, the box will have items that they need, either fidgets or they'll have lotion for massage, things like that. So they'll have things that another person will have to do for them or assist them with. But it'll also have items that they can do on their own, right? For example, putty. Putty is resistive. We put little items in them and they have to search for it. That resistance helps them calm, right? I have another little guy that loves to write in his journal. That's another really wonderful way to calm, right, the system. So there are different ways to do it. I think that also in terms of school, what could benefit the teachers is to try and implement it in the natural routine. So instead of giving an actual sensory break if they can't do it, it would be, let's say, to ask a child to carry books over to a teacher in another classroom if they can, or, you know, go out for a walk, just changing the environment, go get something to drink, push a chair, stack the chairs, right? Try and do it in a more natural kind of routine way. Let's see. Again, I'm going to go back to the idea of if you can also err in terms of, instead of creating a sensory diet, to really get outdoors and play with children outdoors, have games that you do play outdoors, right? So that you encourage, you know what, you know that, you know, in the background, you know that you want to reach an optimal level of arousal. So when you have those ideas in your mind and that you know that that's the goal for your child, make sure that when you're outdoors, he's doing certain things. It will be something like running around, going on slides, which is all the vestibular stuff, getting on the swings, vestibular, versus him sitting around and maybe just walking around in the playground, right? And then finish off with things like climbing, monkey bars, things that, or going to the box of sand and doing something there. Again, we're just going from vestibular to something proprioceptive. So if you have that in your mind, you know that you can actually implement it that way versus doing it from a little sensory box that we bring out tools and play with them. I think the idea that we want to think of long term for some children is, instead of having these activities that are implemented by another person, for example, like we spoke about joint compressions or doing a massage or something like that, ideally what we want is the child to be able to recognize themselves that they need that break and do certain things that they feel help them self-regulate, right? So for example, we spoke about the putty and little items inside it, right? The child can do that on their own. They don't need someone to be there with them to do it. So ideally, we want them to become independent with giving themselves the sensory input that they need. Again, it takes time, it takes awareness, it takes repetition. Again, a lot of little checklists that they could do, a lot of choices. I like to give kids choices. So let's say I'll have a few activities that are vestibular and I offer them those choices, and then a few activities that are proprioceptive and then give them the choice, right? I think it's more, they're the experts, right, in what their body needs. I think that it's important to trust that and to respect that. And again, the long-term goal that we want to think about is, you know, ideally for this child becoming an adult, to create these habits where they can get the sensory input that they need throughout the day in their natural routine without having to take all these breaks, right? So, keeping children active and, helping them from a young age enjoy physical activity. They could get the input from, let's say, taking swim lessons, gymnastics, something that's in their natural routine that'll give them the input that they need, versus, again, taking all these sensory breaks. Again, and my big love is the outdoor play. I mean, I can't stress that enough. If we can play outdoors with the children and be in nature, there's something very healing about nature and very sensory about nature. This is really the best sensory diet that we can provide them. So feel free to send me your questions, or if you already have a sensory diet that you are working with, I would love to hear about that as well. And I'll hear from you soon. Have a good weekend. Bye.